There is a place so far from anywhere else on Earth that the nearest continent is nearly 5,000 kilometers away, farther than flying from London to New York and back again. No cruise ship terminals here, no direct flights from most of the world. Just jagged volcanic peaks rising straight out of the deep Pacific, valleys so steep that entire communities have lived just a few kilometers apart for centuries without ever building a road to connect them. This is the Marquesas, and it might be the most isolated inhabited place you have never heard of. Picture islands with no coral reefs, no calm turquoise lagoons, no gentle white sand beaches, the exact opposite of what you'd expect from French Polynesia. Picture a population that was nearly wiped off the map entirely within a single century, dropping from tens of thousands of people to only a few thousand survivors. And picture a culture so determined to hold onto its identity that it kept its traditions alive underground for decades after they were officially banned. How does a place this remote, this harsh, and this nearly erased manage not only to survive, but to become one of the most spiritually significant destinations in the entire Pacific? Let's go there. First, let's clear up exactly where the Marquesas actually are, because most people picture French Polynesia as one single postcard image, and the Marquesas break that image completely. When people think of French Polynesia, they usually picture Bora Bora or Tahiti, overwater bungalows, calm lagoons, honeymoon resorts built on barrier reefs. The Marquesas share almost none of that. They sit far to the northeast, roughly 1,400 kilometers from Tahiti itself, which is already the administrative and economic center of the entire territory. That distance alone puts the Marquesas closer to the equator and closer to complete isolation than almost any other inhabited island group in French Polynesia. And if you kept traveling northeast from the Marquesas, you would cross nearly 5,000 kilometers of open Pacific before reaching the coastline of Mexico, the nearest continental landmass in that direction. There is no other major island chain nearby to soften that isolation, just deep blue water in every direction. The archipelago itself is made up of a dozen or so volcanic islands, though only 6 are permanently inhabited. Nuku Hiva, Uapo, and Uahuka in the northern group, and Hiva Oa Tahuata, and Fatu Hiva in the south. Unlike the low, flat coral atolls that most people associate with the South Pacific, the Marquesas rise dramatically out of the ocean, their peaks formed by a volcanic hotspot deep beneath the seafloor, the same kind of geological process that built the Hawaiian Islands thousands of kilometers to the north. Sheer cliffs plunge straight into the water, razor-edged ridgelines separate valley from valley. The highest point, Mount Ove on Uapu, climbs to well over 1,200 meters, jagged spires of dark volcanic rock stabbing up through the clouds like something out of a fantasy film. Each of the 6 inhabited islands carries its own personality, shaped by centuries of near-total separation from one another. Nuku Hiva, the largest and most populated, is home to Taiohae, the small administrative capital of the entire archipelago, a town wrapped around a wide seat and sheltered bay, ringed by cliffs so tall they seem to swallow the sky. Uapu is instantly recognizable from the water by its cluster of volcanic spires, dubbed by early sailors as looking almost like the towers of a natural cathedral rising from the sea. Hiva Oa in the southern group is the largest island in that half of the archipelago, its interior thick with tropical forest, climbing toward misty summits. Tiny Fatu Hiva, the southernmost and among the most isolated of all, has no airstrip at all, reachable only by boat, its famous Bay of Virgins carved by volcanic spires, so dramatic that early missionaries reportedly renamed it from a far more suggestive original title to something they considered more appropriate for a Christian map. Even today, getting from one island to another rarely means a quick hop. It usually means a boat, a plane booked days in advance, or patience measured in weeks rather than hours. Here's the detail that surprises almost everyone who learns about the Marquesas for the first time. Unlike nearly every other island group in French Polynesia, the Marquesas have no coral reefs surrounding them. The reason comes down to ocean currents. A cold current sweeping up from the direction of Antarctica keeps the surrounding waters cooler than coral needs to thrive, which means there are no barrier reefs, no calm turquoise lagoons, and none of the postcard shallow water most people associate with this part of the world. Instead, the ocean around the Marquesas is deep, dark, and powerful, crashing directly against black volcanic cliffs and black sand beaches formed from crushed lava rock. It is a completely different kind of beauty, wilder, more dramatic, and far less forgiving. That wildness shaped everything about how people came to live here, and it shaped one of the darkest chapters in the region's history. Archaeological evidence suggests the Marquesas were first settled by Polynesian voyagers well over 1,000 years ago, arriving by canoe across staggering distances of open ocean, using nothing but stars, currents, and generations of accumulated navigational knowledge. Isolated as they were, distinct island communities developed their own dialects, their own carving styles, their own social structures, separated not by ocean this time, but by valleys so steep that traveling from one settlement to the next could take longer than sailing to a different island entirely. By the time European ships began arriving in the Marquesas in the late 16th century, historians estimate the population may have reached somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people. What happened next was catastrophic. Diseases brought by European sailors, smallpox, syphilis, influenza, and others the islanders had never been exposed to before, tore through the population with devastating speed. Within roughly 150 years, the population collapsed to a fraction of its former size, falling to only a few thousand survivors by the early 20th century. It remains one of the steepest population declines recorded anywhere in the Pacific, a demographic catastrophe that nearly erased an entire culture in the span of a few generations. And the cultural loss almost matched the human loss. In the 1830s, Catholic missionaries arriving in the Marquesas moved to suppress traditional Marquesan tattooing, one of the most sophisticated and symbolically rich tattoo traditions anywhere in the Pacific. Missionaries viewed the intricate, full-body designs as pagan and, in some cases, mistakenly blamed them for spreading illness. For decades, the practice was pushed underground, kept alive quietly rather than openly, passed down in fragments rather than in the open ceremonies it once involved. It took the intervention of a French doctor in the early 20th century, who worked to improve public health conditions across the islands to help stabilize the population decline and, gradually, to help conditions improve enough for cultural traditions to begin resurfacing. Today, that same tattoo tradition, once nearly erased entirely, has become one of the most recognized art forms to come out of the Pacific. Marquesan tattoo work is dense, geometric, and deeply symbolic, with patterns historically used to record a person's lineage, achievements, and status, essentially a language written directly onto skin. Historians believe the very word tattoo, now used in nearly every language on Earth, traces back to the Polynesian word tatau, meaning to mark, a linguistic fingerprint left behind by 18th century European sailors who encountered the practice for the first time in this part of the Pacific and had no equivalent word of their own to describe it. Walk through any village today and you'll see it everywhere. On fishermen mending nets, on grandmothers walking to church, on teenagers riding scooters along the coast road. What missionaries once tried to erase has become one of the clearest visual symbols of Marquesan identity in the world, so deeply woven back into daily life that some of today's most respected Marquesan tattoo artists have found themselves working not just in island villages, but aboard the very supply ships that keep the archipelago connected to the outside world, tattooing curious travelers who arrive by sea. Living somewhere this remote comes with logistical challenges most people never have to think about. There is no easy way in or out of the Marquesas. A handful of small airports connect the islands to Tahiti, but flights are limited, weather-dependent, and expensive. For generations, the real lifeline connecting these islands to the outside world and to each other has been the sea. Today, that lifeline takes a very specific form. A combination cargo and passenger ship that makes a roughly 2-week loop from Tahiti through the Marquesas and back, delivering everything from building materials to fuel to crates of local beer, while also carrying a small number of travelers curious enough to make the journey themselves. For islanders, it isn't a cruise. It's the delivery truck, the moving van, and often the only regular link to news and supplies from beyond the horizon. The ship's crew is drawn almost entirely from Polynesian communities across the wider territory, and its arrival at each small harbor is still treated as something close to an event, families gathering at the dock. Cargo winched down onto pallets, mail sorted and handed out by hand, in a scene that has repeated itself twice a month for decades. That physical isolation between islands, and even between valleys on the same island, shaped daily life in ways that still linger today. Steep, forested ridgelines cut so sharply between communities that, historically, some Marquesan valleys developed almost as separate microsocieties, with their own chiefs, their own oral histories, and, in some cases, a level of rivalry and conflict between neighboring valleys that early European visitors found startling. Some of those old rivalries are the origin of exaggerated, sensationalized stories about the islands that spread through Western literature in the 19th century. Stories that often said far more about the fears and biases of the visitors than about the islanders themselves. The American writer Herman Melville spent time in the Taipei Valley on Nuku Hiva in the 1840s, an experience that later inspired his first novel. Introducing many Western readers to the Marquesas for the first time, filtered heavily through his own perspective as an outsider. Later, other outside visitors would leave their own mark. The French painter Paul Gauguin spent his final years on the island of Hiva Oa, drawn by the same remoteness that had defined the islands for centuries, and today his grave sits in a small hillside cemetery overlooking the harbor. Decades later, the Belgian singer Jacques Brel would settle in almost the exact same village, eventually choosing to be buried just steps away from Gauguin's own grave, two very different artists from opposite sides of the 20th century, both pulled toward the same distant dramatic islands, both now resting permanently within sight of the same Pacific horizon. That resurgence has taken visible, organized form. Every few years, thousands of Marquesans gather for the Marquesas Islands Arts Festival, a multi-day celebration of traditional dance, chanting, tattooing, wood and stone carving, and canoe racing that rotates between the islands, drawing performers not just from the Marquesas themselves, but from across the wider Polynesian world. It functions as something between a cultural showcase and a homecoming, a deliberate communal act of keeping traditions alive by practicing them together in public, rather than letting them fade quietly into folklore. For younger Marquesans, many of whom leave for Tahiti or mainland France to pursue education or work that simply doesn't exist on their home islands, the festival has become one of the clearest reasons to return, even briefly, reconnecting with a heritage that their great-grandparents were once forced to hide. Despite that isolation, or perhaps because of it, the Marquesas have never become a mass tourism destination the way Bora Bora or Tahiti have. And in many ways, that's exactly the point. There are no overwater bungalow resorts here, no rows of beach clubs, no direct international flights, bringing in tens of thousands of visitors a year. Getting to the Marquesas takes effort, time, and often more money than a typical Pacific vacation, which has kept the islands from being reshaped around tourism in the way so many other paradise destinations eventually are. For islanders, that isolation is both a genuine hardship and increasingly a form of protection, keeping their culture, their land, and their daily rhythms largely their own. Daily life across the 6 inhabited islands still runs close to the rhythm of subsistence living, even in the 21st century. Many families maintain small gardens and orchards growing breadfruit, bananas, and taro, alongside fishing that remains central to both diet and identity. Wild horses and goats roam some of the more remote hillsides, descendants of animals introduced generations ago, now woven into the landscape as much as the volcanic peaks themselves. Villages tend to be small, tightly connected and deeply rooted in extended family networks, where church, family gatherings, and traditional dance performances remain central to community life rather than staged attractions for outsiders. Food here reflects that same blend of tradition and isolation. Breadfruit, known locally as mei, has been a dietary staple for centuries, sometimes fermented and stored underground in pits, a technique that historically allowed communities to preserve food through leaner seasons or the aftermath of a damaging storm. Fresh tuna, caught just offshore in waters far too deep and cold for coral to form, appears at nearly every meal, often eaten raw with coconut milk and lime in a dish shared across much of French Polynesia. Goat, descended from animals brought by European ships centuries ago, has become woven into local cuisine as thoroughly as anything native to the islands. None of it arrives in supermarkets, stocked from container ships, the way food does on more accessible islands. Much of it still comes from a garden a family has tended for generations, or a boat that went out that same morning. Spiritually and culturally, the islands remain marked by an older worldview that Christianity never fully erased, despite more than a century of missionary influence. Scattered through overgrown forest clearings and hillside terraces are archaeological sites known as mi, ceremonial platforms once used for religious rituals. Feasting, and, according to oral histories, occasionally darker practices tied to warfare between rival valleys, practices that early European accounts often exaggerated or sensationalized to paint the islanders as savages in need of civilizing, a narrative historians today treat with considerable skepticism. Alongside these platforms stand tiki, carved stone or wooden figures representing ancestors or deities, some towering several meters tall, their blank, heavy-browed faces staring out over valleys that, in places, look almost untouched by the intervening centuries. Unlike the Moai of Easter Island, far to the southeast, Marquesan tiki were never abandoned or forgotten by their descendants. Today, they remain woven into a living identity, referenced in tattoo design, in carving, and in the way islanders describe their own connection to ancestors who arrived here by canoe more than 1,000 years ago. Economically, the Marquesas depend heavily on a combination of small-scale agriculture, particularly the cultivation of copra, dried coconut flesh pressed for oil, along with fishing, limited tourism, and significant financial support from the French state, which continues to fund much of the infrastructure, healthcare, and education across French Polynesia's more remote territories. It is not an economy built on international finance or global industry, the way some island territories have transformed themselves. It remains, in large part, a subsistence and small trade economy shaped by geographic isolation as much as by deliberate choice. Administratively, the islands fall under French Polynesia, itself an overseas collectivity of France, which means residents carry French citizenship, vote in French elections, and rely on a currency and legal system set thousands of kilometers away in Paris, even as daily life on the ground remains distinctly, unmistakably Marquesan. French and Marquesan are both spoken across the islands, often within the same household, a reminder that this remote outpost belongs to two very different worlds at once. That isolation also means the Marquesas face very real, ongoing challenges, ones that no amount of cultural richness fully erases. And yet, in 2024, the Marquesas received a recognition that placed them formally among the most significant cultural and natural landscapes on Earth, when UNESCO designated the islands a World Heritage Site, recognizing both their extraordinary volcanic landscapes and the depth of the Marquesan cultural heritage that has endured despite everything working against its survival. It was, in many ways, a formal acknowledgement of a story that islanders had already been telling for generations, that a population reduced to a fraction of its former size, on a culture that had its most sacred traditions banned outright, and a landscape too remote and too rugged for easy development, had not simply survived, but had preserved something the rest of the world increasingly recognizes as irreplaceable. That challenges remain is not in question. Healthcare access is limited on the smaller islands, often requiring medical evacuation to Tahiti for anything beyond basic treatment, a flight that can take hours even in an emergency. Higher education typically means leaving the islands entirely, a pattern that has pulled younger generations toward Tahiti or mainland France in search of opportunities that simply don't exist locally, creating a slow, ongoing drain on the population that island leaders continue to grapple with. Import costs remain high, given how much has to be shipped enormous distances by sea, and a delayed supply ship can mean weeks of shortages on smaller islands with no backup plan. And, like many remote Pacific communities, questions about long-term environmental change, including how shifting ocean patterns might affect fishing grounds and increasingly unpredictable storm seasons, weigh on a population whose entire way of life is tied directly to the surrounding ocean. Ancient me platforms and their watchful stone tiki still stand in overgrown ceremonial sites across several of the islands, silent witnesses to a history that survived being nearly erased twice, once by disease and once by decree. Traditional dance troupes still perform at island festivals, their movements drawn directly from stories and ceremonies that missionaries once tried to erase entirely. And the tattoo needle, once forced into hiding, now marks the skin of islanders proudly, openly, a permanent reminder that identity, once nearly lost, was ultimately theirs to reclaim. For the people who call these 6 islands home, the Marquesas were never really forgotten, despite how the rest of the world sometimes describes them. They were simply left alone by geography, by ocean currents that kept the reefs from forming, by mountains too steep to easily divide into resort developments, by a distance from the rest of the world that most tourism infrastructure has never quite found a way to overcome. What looks from the outside like the edge of the map is, for the people living there, simply home, shaped by an isolation that nearly destroyed it once, and that now, quietly, helps protect what's left. If this journey into one of the Pacific's most remote and resilient island cultures caught your attention, subscribe, because there are countless more places like this out there, forgotten by the rest of the world, but very much alive to the people who call them home.